everyone, welcome back to the channel. I am getting ready to use this month's scrapbooking kit and the foundry waxes from this month's mixed media kit to create a grungy junk journal. I'm just going to go over what's in the scrapbooking kit real quick. There are all of these mechanicals from Finnabair, a pack of little metal embellishments and some Prima flowers, and then the chipboard and 12 by 12 sheets and cut apart sheets from the Grunge Reinvented collection from 3/4 Designs. I'm gonna break this video up into sections because I kind of go back and forth a lot while I'm making it. I work on the cover a little and I work on the inside a little, and I thought that would be far too confusing in a video, just keep going back and forth. So I have grouped the majority of my cover assembly, and that's what I'm going to go over first. I don't really do a how-to, I just go over I just kind of highlight what's going on. It's a mixed media cover, and a lot of my theory for mixed media is if at first I don't succeed, add another layer. And I did that a lot. I kept adding layers until I got a cover that I was happy with and I thought the colors worked well and it was sufficiently grungy. For my cover, I used some Kaisercraft corrugated cardboard, and I flattened out sections of it, and then I cut it into strips, and then I just backed it with some deli paper and some matte medium and layered them up. The pieces that I flattened out are underneath, and then the pieces that I left the ridges up on are just sort of at the edges on top. After I had my original pieces that I put down, I decided to just finish off that whole piece of corrugated cardboard. I used some of the ends to make them kind of look like patches, and made sure everything was glued down with that matte medium. Even though this does not show up in the finished product, I wanted to show what my layers consisted of. This is not regular cardstock. This is a linen blend cardstock from Country Craft Creations. It's an artisan cardstock, and I used that because, as you can see, it was a very, very messy process. I'm just putting the colors up that I'm using as I go through here. All of the products are on the blog. After I went through all that trouble of creating my corrugated cardboard pieces, I decided to cut them down and kind of make them look like they had sharp edges. And I shaped it a little bit, give it a little bit of a ridge, sort of like corrugated steel. I used my amazing cast resin just to help give a little bit of support without adding a lot of weight. I had pieces of tissue paper left over that have some iron-on interfacing on them from the project that will be next week, and I just added it to that cardstock. And then I started adding in some of the layers of the cardboard, some corrugated resin. I just poured my resin onto an embossing folder, and some chicken wire. I tried to make sure that all of my edges and sharp parts were covered. So I poked holes through and tucked the tips of that chicken wire underneath the cardstock to make sure that there wasn't any pokey parts in there. And then to add a little bit of extra texture, I just used my tiny attacher and held down the edges of my chicken wire. And I just popped a single brad in around the center of that chicken wire just to help hold it against the surface. I wasn't entirely sure what direction I was going to be taking with everything. I just started grabbing items up and seeing what I could do with it. And then to make extra sure that all of those pokey pieces stayed where I put them, I added some E6000 and some bookbinding tape to help hold everything in place. After my 2 gessos were dry, I added some burnt sienna liquid acrylic paint, give it a little bit more grunginess on it. And then because I was really kind of feeling the color green, this is the Rustic Wilderness Distress Paint. A little bit of Rustic Wilderness Distress Oxide, and some Rustic Wilderness embossing glaze. This is some Finnabair graphite texture paste, and I brush it on lightly to lighten up some of the areas, give it more of that grungy look. These lighter grays that are coming up, they are just all those Halloween distress pastes. This is the cream Finnabair Rust Effect paste. I think it's Rust Effect paste. Anyway, it's Finnabair cream paste, texture paste. And then I brushed on some embossing ink from my refill bottle, added some different embossing powders. I have some Seth Apter in here, the Sand, the Rocky Road, a little bit more, or the Rustic Wilderness. This is a combination of the cream Finnabair paste, the transparent distress paste, and the Finnabair rusty paste, and some Seth Apter baked textures, some Seth Apter baked textures rust or something like that. I added some Finnabair stars from the Stars and Moons mold. I coated them with black gesso and then added some ink black liquid acrylic paint. And while I just had that off to the side and let it dry, I worked on that piece from the paper pack and got it ready to go on the front. I have 3 layers of the extra thick embossing powder on there, and then I added a little bit of a sprinkling of some of the Antiquities embossing powder, and then I added the Tim Holtz foundry waxes that are in this month's mixed media kit. This is some Nouveau, it's a glitter paste, I don't remember what the name of it is, but it's in a seaweed green, something like that, seafoam green. And I just put it on lightly in a few areas, get that green to pop back out. I have some embellishment mousse that I just brush on really light, mostly for the shine and the color. And I have some Finnabair in the black onyx, the Jewel Effect paste in black onyx. Then I add my foundry waxes to my stars and get my splatter on there for a little bit extra sparkle. I topped the 3 main stars with those 3 pieces that are in the scrapbooking kit, and then I set everything off and let it dry. Well, I worked on the 1/2-inch herringbone strips that I was going to be using for my hinging, and I just used a variety of alcohol mixatives and alcohol inks to grunge them up. For my cover, I decided to use these strips from the hanging folders, and I doubled them up to give them a little bit of extra strength and put them together with my E6000. Then I marked where my little hinging strips there were going to be and where my herringbone twill pieces were going to be, and I marked out the spacing. I have 5 on there. The inner lines are where I'm going to cut out to add the metal pieces. I cut it out, you can see, fit that metal piece in there, and then I wanted to really make sure that it stayed, and I have this JB weld, and since it mixed up a nice gray color, goes with that grunge, I added it in to really hold those strips to that chipboard. I peeled off a few layers of the chipboard from the strip I cut out, and then just fit in the extra piece to cover up the side of the chipboard that is going to be the inside parts of the cover. And then partly to cover up where that JB weld was, and partly to hold it together while I continued working, and just to help make sure that it was smooth, I added a strip of bookbinding tape across that JB weld and that piece of chipboard that I had placed back in. I cut slots out on the cover pieces just so the hanging folder pieces would show. This much of my cover is done. I haven't decided on my inside, so I am going to set this off to the side and move on to talking about the inside of this junk journal. Now that the majority of my cover is complete, I am going to switch over and talk about what I'm working on for the inside. I have my hanging folders cut to size, and I have already picked out the majority of my papers. I have some regular copy paper, some tea-dyed paper, some vintage music sheets, some envelopes. For the center section here, it is just some sari silk, and it is only going to have blank pages in it. And then my third signature is like the first one, with a few pages for writing, some envelopes, doilies, regular standard junk journal insides for right now. I used my envelope punch board to create a couple of envelopes from some green paper, and then I created a cut file to make these coin envelopes, large coin envelopes, and I cut them out of some pattern paper. It's lighter than heavier printer paper. The printer paper is usually 20 to 24 pounds. I don't think that this pattern paper is even that much. I also didn't want a lot of bulk. I was going to already be having bulk added when I got to the papers that are in this month's scrapbooking kit. I have already done one of the envelopes. This was my practice one to make sure that things were going to work how I was picturing them. And I'm just going to show you real quick on this one what I did. I just have some collage medium, some distress collage medium, and I am brushing it on in a thin layer. I wanted to use a collage medium because it stays flexible after it's dry. It stays flexible. Mod Podge would work as well. Anything like that that's thin, clear if you want it clear, or a vintage tint if you wanted a vintage tint. But something thin that still isn't going to add a lot of bulk and that will remain flexible. This is how I decided to strengthen my envelopes, my pattern paper. This is tea bag paper, so it is very thin. It acts kind of like rice paper when that collage medium goes on. It almost disappears. It's relatively strong, and it holds up to the moisture well, being tea bag paper, and it doesn't add a lot of bulk. So I keep the bulk down on these coin envelopes, but I am still able to reinforce them. After I had my tea bag paper down and that collage medium had dried, I decided I wanted to add just a little bit extra to them. So I dug out the remainder of the package of the Dress My Craft Transfer Me's. I think they came out last June, June 21 mixed media kit. So I just picked out a few of those Transfer Me's and put them in place before I continued on with the rest of my envelope. To add some variations in the color, I used the brush corduroy distress ink and distress oxides, and the distress ink I just used with my blending brush, And then for the Distress Oxide, I just used that with the Tim Holtz Bubbles stamp. After I have everything down the way I wanted, blended the way I wanted, I take my envelope outside and I give it a spray with some semi-gloss clear Rust-Oleum. I do it for a couple of reasons. First, it will seal in those distress inks and that Distress Oxide, especially the oxide being on top of the collage medium because it would just smear. And second reason is if you've used collage mediums, they may be sealers, but they always feel sticky no matter how long they sit. So adding this clear sealer, besides sealing up those inks, it makes the surface no longer sticky. I wanted to reinforce the opening on those coin envelopes, so I just added some self-adhesive textile surfaces from Tim Holtz. I just hand cut and hand traced the shape of the opening, and I did add a little bit of extra glue just because I'm putting it on after spraying it with the Rust-Oleum. And then I pop on my circles and pop in the eyelets and get that string closure on. I have my signatures laid out the way they're going to be going in, and I did also decide to add some binding to clean up the edges of my covers, and I added more of the Tim Holtz tiny attacher staples. They are not holding it on, I do have it sewn on. I just added them for some decoration, and I added some little pieces that I had of those textile surfaces just to add a little bit more interest, sort of make it look like it's patched together. I took this sari silk scrap and cut it to 2 equal lengths, tied a knot in one end, and glued it down flat on the other end. Well, mostly flat as I could get it. And I made sure to tuck it in pretty far, just because I wanted to be sure that it would stay in place, even though I do later come back and I decided to add a little bit extra reinforcement where that sari silk comes out of the edge, but I don't get to that until after everything's sewn together, because I decided to make it as difficult as possible for myself. My sari silk glued in, I am now getting my inside papers cut to size so that I can finish my cover before I start stitching in my signatures. Besides the Fabri-Tac that I used underneath the sari silk ends, I added some double-sided tape to help hold it down flat, and then brushed on some PVA glue before adding in the papers. I had cut my papers to be more or less the exact same size as the cover pieces, so I just came through with my sanding block and roughed up the edges of those papers and used that as my way to make sure they were even with the cover, and then came in with that brushed corduroy distress ink and added it along the edges. And then to grunge up those little bits of the textile surfaces, I added that brushed corduroy to them too, just because they looked too clean next to everything else. And then just to hold that ink in place so it wouldn't smear, I just added some workable fixative. For the construction of the journal, for adding the signatures into that open spine, I cut a template of how wide I wanted my spine, and I marked where the herringbone strips would be, and I poke a hole on each side of those strips, well, each side of where the thread will be going through. I'm going to put a link in the description box and on the blog where I originally got the idea for this open spine, this particular open spine. I do make a few variations to it, but if you go and you check out the website, it has a step-by-step with pictures of what she did when she did a herringbone open spine. Because this is a junk journal and my spine isn't the same thickness as my insides, I don't leave my herringbone strips loose the way they are in the tutorial on the website. I stitch through mine so my signatures won't slide around. I don't know how else to explain that. I more or less do exactly what is on the website, except I don't want my signatures to slide on my herringbone, so I gently stitch them in place. And there you have it. As it is right now, my signatures are just as thick as my cover. By the time I get all my decoration and my tucks and my flaps in, then the extra length on my closure comes in handy. You can see I have already started to really thicken things up. I have added pockets to the front and the back covers. That's just a piece of some handmade paper. I play around with my scraps of paper every once in a while and get some interesting things. So now I am just going to work with the rest of the papers from the kit, some papers from my stash, some ribbons, some thread, some bits and pieces that I have, and start making the clusters that will go on as decoration, start layering up the papers to make tuck-in spots, and just in general do the regular junk journal work from here on. I'll go over a little bit about what each thing is, but there are so many different junk journal tutorials out in the world now that I don't think it's necessary to do a step-by-step, especially since this is a grunge one. I really went with that grunge and didn't particularly worry about neatness or super matchy-matchy. I just started grabbing up items and sticking them together. Okay, through the magic of video editing, I'm going to jump right up on ahead. I have my first signature done. I have my extra reinforcements on my front cover in place. I just used some Chicago screws. That's the style of the screw. They basically look like the extender posts for traditional post-bound scrapbooks, and some bookbinding tape. But I will get to that, and I will go over how I reinforced my edges when I do the back cover. I saved the back cover for that. This music paper was old, so it tore easy, and still going with the grunge. I wasn't really worried about it. I just used some linen hinging tape, added some of the brushed corduroy to grunge it up, and taped over those places. I think it works really well to go with that grunge thing sort of being patched together. You can see I have a lot of tuck-in spots. I have my envelopes. I have pockets. I used some of that chipboard from the paper pack and added it on with decoration, and I'll go over the colors that I used on that for the embossing. I did a combination. Sometimes I would use my tiny attacher, and sometimes I would use stitching, sometimes I would use both. I never made it so that my staples would show, or the bottom of the staples would show, and also so that nobody would get poked by them. So I tried to cover them up. And here is the start of my third signature. I did the first half of it, just tuck-in spots, pockets. I have parchment paper in there because some places were still drying when I was working on this. Those white sheets, they were the legal sized sheets, so they stuck out a little further, so I just folded them over so they would fit in when everything was said and done. I used my clips just to hold things out of place while I worked. Used the weight of my arm a lot to hold things. This was my process throughout the whole thing. I didn't worry about straight edges because more often than not I would rough them up and add ink. Sometimes I would use my punch and add a little notebook edge to them. I more or less estimated the sizes I would need and then take them off and work on them before trying to glue them in. And that's what I'm doing here. These are for the two middle envelope on that third signature. Just a lot of cutting, tearing, distressing, and inking.
Like my final day, you can't take that away.
For the larger envelopes that were from my Recollections craft stock card blanks, I would just roughly tear or cut my papers or my materials to size and just line them up and staple them or sew them and glue them down the same as I did all the other clusters throughout here, just making sure that I didn't cover the opening too much, and making sure that the flap would cover the envelope when it was closed. That the decorative part of the, I guess I should say that, so that none of the original envelope would show through when the flap was closed. And now, what I did to reinforce my sari silk coming out of the covers was I used some E6000 to help hold my bookbinding tape down. I added bookbinding tape to the inside and the outside of the cover. That's not what's holding it. That is decorative more than anything. I folded back the sari silk tie, added some E6000 underneath it and on top of it, and folded it. I folded it back and then folded it forward again. I guess we'll say that. I hope that makes sense. You can see what I'm talking about there in the video. And sandwiched it between E6000 layers and that bookbinding tape. My E6000 right now is nowhere near set all the way up, but I thought I would finish this up. I punched 2 holes in, making sure that it would hit the sari silk, and then put the shortest Chicago style screws I had through those holes. I added some E6000 and I added a couple of washers just to make sure that the screw in part was tight against the cover. I added some Loctite to the threads, screwed them into the posts, and cleaned up any excess that had squoze out, and clipped everything down to hold it until that E6000 set up. Any of the large pieces I had left of the cardstock from the kit, I just cut into tags, added various strings. I used my corner chomper to do my corners, punched holes, used the hole reinforcement punch to just cut out of any scrap pieces I had of either my file folders or smaller pieces of the cardstock, added them to the tag holes and just set them off. And after the glue was dry, then I just stuck them into random pockets. I saved this little pile of cardstock pieces so I could show you what I did with the pieces that are already finished and in the first signature. On the film strip frames, I used 4 different embossing powders. I just grabbed up my my Lawn Fawn fake tan because it's that deeper orange, and any of it that would show through would just go with that rusty look I had. I used the South After Rocky Road baked textures, dumped it off, added on Ancient Amber baked textures, melted those together, and while they were still hot, I added more Rocky Road, melted that down, added some Chunky Rust, melted that down, and then added some Rusty Hinge embossing glaze. For the leaves, I used the foundry waxes from this month's mixed media kit. I added some of the brushed corduroy as a base for any areas that might show through. On this one, I used the foundry waxes from this month's mixed media kit, and I didn't spread it out or brush it out. I puddled it up because once it starts heating up, then I could move it around. You can see there as it melts and starts to set up, I can blow that puddle around and then just fill in any extra holes that I might want covered. But I found this to be a fun way to use those two waxes and to mix them up with each other. Another option is, after I added my brushed corduroy, then I did brush on a thin layer. I put on the foundry waxes and then just brushed them on and then heated them up and set them. Some of the other ways that I made some embellishments for my junk journal was to use those cut apart sheets and some glossy accents. On the cut apart sheet buttons, I used an awl and poked holes in where the buttonholes were, added some brushed corduroy to everything so that the white edges didn't show up. And this is a piece of the bookbinding thread that I had left over that I had cut off when I did the signatures, and I just put it through the holes a few times that I had poked with that awl so that it looked more like it was sewn on. And then I used my glossy accents just to create a faux epoxied looking surface. And now I'm just using the little bits I had left and finishing up turning my film strip frames into little clusters to add into my third signature. Finally, my grungy journal is finished. It's not all the way dry yet. I will have a link to the regular speed flip through in the description box and on the blog. I am just going to use this sped up version for the end of this video. I hope that you enjoyed this video and it gave you some ideas of how you can use the papers in this month's scrapbooking kit, how you can interpret the mood board, and how to use those foundry waxes. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications if you haven't already, so you will always know when new videos get posted. Give us a thumbs up and feel free to share this video. Thank you, and I will see you again next week.